Patricia Crone, in her work on Meccan Trade, Mecca from Mecca, and the rise of Islam, adds a practical reason which is too often overlooked by earlier historians. She points out that Mecca was a barren place, and barren places do not make natural halts. And, least of all, when they are found at a short distance from famously green environments. Why should caravans have made a steep descent to the barren valley of Mecca when they could have stopped at Taif? Mecca did, of course, have both a well and a sanctuary, but so did Taif, which had food supplies too. So, Patricia Crone goes on to say, furthermore, what commodity was available in Arabia that could be transported such a distance through such an inhospitable environment and still be sold at a profit large enough to support the growth of a city in a peripheral state of bereft of natural resources? It wasn't incense, spices, and other exotic goods, as many notoriously unreliable earlier writers have intimated. See Crone's discussion on the problem of historical accuracy, particularly between Lammens, Watts, Kister, and Meccan Trade. According to the latest and much more reliable research by Kister and Sprenger, the Arabs engaged in a trade of a considerably humbler kind, that of leather and clothing, hardly items which could have founded a commercial empire of international dimensions as made out to be in the Koran. The real problem with Mecca, however, is that there simply was no international trade taking place in Arabia, let alone in Mecca in the centuries immediately prior to Muhammad's birth. It seems that much of our data in this area has been spurious from the outset due to sloppy research of the original sources carried out by Lammens, an unreliable scholar, and repeated by the great Orientalists such as Watts, Shaven, Rodinson, Hitti, Lewis, and Shahid. Lammens, using first-century sources such as Peripheral and Pliny, should have used the later Greek historians who were closer to the events. Had he referred to the later historians, he would have found that the Greek trade between India and the Mediterranean was entirely maritime after the 1st century AD. So much for the Mecca, which was not a seaport. So, had the later historians been referred to, would have found that the Greek trade between India and the Mediterranean was entirely maritime after the 1st century AD. One need only look at a map to understand why. It made little sense to ship goods across such distances by land when a waterway was available close by. Patricia Crone points out that in Diocletian's Rome it was cheaper to ship wheat 1,250 miles by sea than to transport it 50 miles by land. The distance from Najran, Yemen in the south to Gaza in the north was roughly 1,250 miles. So the question is asked, why would the traders ship their goods from India by sea and unload it at Aden, where it would be put on the backs of much slower and more expensive camels to trudge 1,250 miles across the inhospitable Arabian desert to Gaza, when they could simply have left it on the ships and followed the Red Sea route up the west coast of Arabia? There were other problems as well. Had Lammens researched his sources correctly, he would have also found that the Greco-Roman trade with India collapsed by the 3rd century AD, so that by Muhammad's time there was not only no overland route, but no Roman market to which the trade was destined. He would have similarly found out that what trade remained was controlled by the Ethiopians and not by the Arabs, and that Adulis, the port city on the Ethiopian coast of the Red Sea, and not Mecca, was the trading center of that region. Of even more significance, had Lammens taken the time to study the early Greek sources, he would have discovered that the Greeks to whom the trade went had never even heard of a place called Mecca. If, according to the Muslim traditions and recent Orientalists, Mecca was so important, certainly those to whom the trade was going would have noted its existence. Yet we find nothing. Crone, in her work, points out that the Greek trading documents refer to the towns of Taif, which is southeast and close to present-day Mecca, and to Yathrib, later Medina, as well as Khaybar in the north. But no mention is made of Mecca. That indeed is troubling for the historicity of a city whose importance lies at the center of the nascent Islam. Had the later Orientalists bothered to check out Lammens' sources, they too would have realized that since the overland route was not used after the 1st century AD, it certainly was not in use in the 5th or 6th centuries, and much of what has been written concerning Mecca would have been corrected long before now. Finally, the problem of locating Mecca in the early secular sources is not unique, for there is even some confusion within Islamic tradition as to where exactly Mecca was initially situated. According to research carried out by J. Van S. in both the First and Second Civil Wars, there are accounts of people proceeding from Medina to Iraq via Mecca. Also Muhammad B. Ahmad al-Dahabi. Yet Mecca is southwest of Medina, and Iraq is northeast. Thus, the sanctuary for Islam, according to these traditions, was at one time north of Medina, which is the opposite direction from where Mecca is today. So we are left with a quandary. If, according to documentary evidence, in this case the ancient Greek historical and trading documents, Mecca was not the great commercial center the late Muslim traditions would have us believe, if it was not known by the people who lived and wrote from that period, and if it could not even qualify as a viable city during the time of Muhammad, it certainly could not have been the center of the Muslim world at that time. How then can we believe that the Quran is reliable? The documentary evidence not only contradicts its dating on the split between the Arabs and the Jews, but the city it identifies as the birthplace and cornerstone for the nascent Islam cannot be identified even with any historical accuracy until at least a full century later. Do these same problems exist with the Bible? No. Well, let's move on and see whether that's a good answer. Let's continue it on. The Bible's documentary evidence. Quran 5.htm. Let's switch over to the original document. Quran 5. This guy is a really good historian. The Bible. Now that we read about the paltry historical evidence, the documentary evidence for the Quran, let's look at the Bible. Historical comparison. The Bible's documentary evidence. The documentary evidence for the reliability of the Bible has been an area of research which has been increasing rapidly over the last few decades. But this hasn't been always been so. The assumption by many former archaeologists was that the Old Testament was written not in the 10th to 14th centuries BC by the authors described within its text, but by later Jewish historians during the much later 2nd to 6th century BC, and that these stories were then redacted back onto the great prophets such as Moses and David. Yet with enormous quantity of data which has been uncovered and is continuing to be uncovered, as well as the new forensic research methods being employed to study them, what we are now finding is that many of these preconceived notions of authorship are simply no longer valid. For instance, the laws of Hammurabi. The skeptics contended that the Pentateuch could not have been written by Moses because there was no evidence of any writing that early. Then the black stele was found with the detailed laws of Hammurabi, which were written 300 years before Moses and in the same region. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Boy, this was a big one. This is a big one, 1948. It just threw out everything. The skeptics were just completely destroyed. Dead Sea Scrolls. Let me underline it. I'm always glad to review this kind of stuff because I don't review it enough. There was much doubt as to the reliability of the Old Testament documents since the oldest manuscript in our possession was the Masoretic text written about 916 AD. How, the skeptics ask, can we depend on a set of writings whose earliest manuscripts are so recent? Then came the amazing discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, written around 125 BC. These scrolls show us that outside of minute copying errors, it is identical to the Masoretic text, and yet it predates it by over 1,000 years. We have further corroboration in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, translated around 150 to 200 BC. Wow. Yet, to please the skeptics, the best documentary evidence for the reliability of the biblical text must come from documents external to the biblical texts themselves. There's always been doubt concerning the stories of Abraham and the patriarchs found in the books attributed to Moses, the Pentateuch, those 5 first books. The skeptics maintain that there was no method of ascertaining their reliability, since we have no corroboration from external secular accounts. They're still adamant about saying the Bible is not reliable. It's fiction. This has all changed, for instance. Now let's take a look at some of these discoveries. Okay, other discoveries, early discoveries outside of the Bible. How much backup do we have here compared to the Quran? Discoveries at Nuzi, Mari, Assyrian, Hittite, Sumerian, and Eshuna codes. Discoveries from excavations at Nuzi, Maria, Assyrian, Hittite, Sumerian, and Eshuna codes point out that Hebrew poetry, Mosaic legislation, as well as the Hebrew social customs all fit the period and region of the patriarchs. So don't try to just denigrate the Bible when we have all this extra biblical supports, discoveries, geological discoveries. Inscriptions of Hittite civilization. According to the historians, there were no Hittites at the time of Abraham, thus the historicity of the biblical accounts described in them was questionable. Now, we know from inscriptions of that period that there were 1,200 years of Hittite civilization, much of it corresponding with the patriarchal period. Horites discovered. Underline all of these. The historians also told us that no such people as the Horites existed. So much for them. It is these people whom we find mentioned in the genealogy of Esau in Genesis 36:20. Oh, there, see, it's not Bible, it's all fiction. Yet now they have been discovered as a group of warriors also living in Mesopotamia during the patriarchal period. 6th century East India inscription. All these archaeological discoveries. The account of Daniel, according to the skeptical historians, most have been written in the 2nd century and not the 6th century BC because of all the precise historical detail found in its contents. Yet now the 6th century's East India inscription corresponds with the Daniel 4:30 account of Nebuchadnezzar's building, proving that the author of Daniel must have been an eyewitness from that period. Either way, it is amazing. The strongest case for extra-biblical corroboration of the patriarchal period is found in 4 sets of tablets which have been and are continuing to be uncovered from that area of the world. Since I wrote these documents and copied them down to this website, there many more have been discovered. They demonstrate that the biblical account is indeed historically reliable. Let's briefly look at all 4 sets of tablets. The Amarna tablets. Amarna tablets from Egypt mention the Habiru or Apiru in Hebrew, which was first applied to Abraham in Genesis 14:13. So much for that corroboration, right? Amazing. Elba tablets. Here's another great one. The Elba tablets, 17,000 tablets from Tel Mardika, northern Syria, dating from 2300 BC, shows that 1,000 years before Moses, laws, customs, and events were recorded in writing in that part of the world, and that the judicial proceedings and case laws were very similar to the Deuteronomy law code Deuteronomy 22:22 to 30.